Before you ask, yes, the main reason I am doing this video is, in fact, the name itself being funny to me. I had the idea for a title several months ago, and decided, let's get this video done. So yeah, this is that video. Anyways, objectives are a thing. They are a very important thing too. Probably the most important change from PvZ1 to PvZ2. Probably is also a keyword for sure there, but it's true. Objectives, in their current format, are sorta contrived and shouldn't really exist, as they originate from a very different system. Early PvZ2 is just weird, but they do exist, and they are fairly interesting if nothing else. Objectives are these little pop-ups before you begin a level, forcing you to beat a level with a certain restriction or goal to keep in mind. These can vary widely, and I mean super widely, from beating a level while never being able to have more than 6 plants in the field, to having to produce 2,000 sun, to having to make 15 different zombies fear for the damn life. There is a lot. Some of these, evidently, are less interesting than others. Therefore, there is something to rank. And I don't know, I feel like I'm missing out on having a ranking video, and this seems super fitting for me. Mostly because it's dumb, and nobody else would ever think of it. Okay, so let's cover a broad way we plan on actually ranking these. Firstly, we'll be using this tier list. I'll try my best to make each one evident, but it may be harder. Beyond that thought, we'll have to ensure we aren't picking dumb options for the sake of picking dumb options. So how would we plan to actually tier each thing? Before we get started, I'll be covering each objective in the order they appear in PvZ2 chronologically, as in left to right. I could have wrote a funny bit about going straight to Jurassic Marsh here, and ranking them there, but I cannot be bothered. I'll also be considering mods here. I'll try to avoid many mod objectives unless I deem them common enough to bring up, so I won't be talking about Eclise's sun graves, for instance. I also may not have footage for everything. A while back I lost all my progress on every mod ever, which is annoying, but whatever. If a background doesn't necessarily match up, that's why. Oh, and this is fairly important, but I'm ranking objectives and not levels. This is important to note as each objective will have at least a level that suffers due to it by their nature. Just to clarify. And despite this title, this video is actually only objective because I'm saying it, and clearly I'm incapable of being wrong under any circumstance. Deal with it. And no minigames either because those just aren't objectives. You get me? Anyways, let's get started with the first objective a player ever sees. Locked and Loaded. I love starting out a video with a weird objective that's hard to determine. Whatever. These levels are the ones that force you to use certain plants, with no chance for the player to choose anything else. Later worlds have levels which only lock off a seed bank. We aren't talking about those. This is purely the player being forced to use an odd selection of plants. And as a result, this objective is fantastic. Locked and Loadeds are the name usually used to this objective. This objective totally shapes the way the player has to approach a level, as it entirely redefines everything. The plants you bring are what the level has to play off after all, so changing them forces the player to change their plans entirely. Unless they happen to pick the deck they already ran, but like, you aren't running dumb decks all the time, which is the main appeal, as you're forced into a gimmicky deck often. This can be as simple as AltverZ forcing you to use only melee plans for a level, to as complex as Eclise wanting you to run a deck being forced to use Explonet and Carrot as your only form of DPS. This one is especially fantastic, and a huge part of what makes this objective probably the best in the game. Though that's kinda cheating, as it's super versatile and can do really anything. I mean, hell, even Vanilla has levels which force you that Sun produces in Velocity 8, a level only of Primal Plants in Day 29 of Jurassic Marsh, or even force use Peanuts in Day 18 of Dark Ages. The monsters! The main two issues with this objective are fairly simple. Firstly, the player is actually forced to improve and, as they say, get good. Or grind levels, but we basically never talk about levels here. Either way, improvement is the only way to get by. No clever deck building will help you here. PvZ2, as much as I love it otherwise, is a casual game first and tower defense second, so this can be a turnoff. Another issue is the lack of replayability. A lot of levels are good levels because you can return with other plants and get an entirely different experience. Locked and Loaded levels aren't really like that, so yeah. For the record, the former is why the loss condition is so low. The player loses because they have no clue how to use the plants they are forced with, resulting in these levels being capable of being excessively frustrating, which can be a real issue, and is more common than I'd like. The inability to play the level differently each run certainly doesn't help either. However, overall, locked and loadeds are fantastic, and are some of the best objectives in the game, so I elect to ignore this. Honestly, I didn't think these were so early. Whatever, mold colonies are a very simple objective. See that space on the lawn? You can't plant there anymore. Have fun. And these objectives are generally alright. Vanilla has a really poor habit of wasting these, always featuring levels which use molds only at the back, which don't do a whole lot. I mean, they technically do, but they do the exact same thing each time, making melee and ambush threats like Explorer or Relic Hunter more dangerous. This is just fairly boring, and what most mods do with it is way more interesting, where they can kinda just be anywhere. Force the player into the middle of the lawn, remove lights entirely, or some other wacky shenanigan with world gimmicks like Slayer Tiles in mind. There are some genuinely fun and interesting ways to use molds. Though, well, some is broadly a main issue. Mold tiles are very passive as an objective, acting more of a passive annoyance in a lot of cases, so often they can be unnoticeable. Not always, just sometimes. Though sometimes still suck, but hey, what you gonna do? Well, beyond knock it down a tier, I guess. Molds are also kinda just whatever to play around often. They require being used in interesting ways to make a level better. For instance, being used with zombies that knock you forward, or a level where every other tile is covered with one, to really be that fun or unique. But they can sorta fall by the wayside often. I think these work best as a rare objective with precision as a result. Though one of the best things this objective has going for it is that it is so passive, but I feel it makes most levels built around them less frustrating. It feels less like an arbitrary loss to me, as it does an actual failure, which is an improvement over many other objectives. If you're the kind of guy which hates most objectives, or struggles with the game in general, this is likely one of your favourite objectives due to the fact it's less likely to make a level horrendously difficult for you, which is nice. It just doesn't cut it for me, so while it's good, it's not going to be S or A tier. This is irrelevant, but its objective is probably the most hotly contended overall. Sometimes people love it, sometimes people hate it, well, so I found out in the small poll I did before making this video. I find this funny, but did a better space to bring it up. This is probably the most controversial objective. Of all things. Okay, so taking a lock and loader's ability to force you into using certain plants, but remove the need for a player to actually have them, instead forcing a player to build around them. Then add a million more ways for this objective to be used. These plants are endangered, and by the lord am I glad they are. And this is probably the best objective in the game. These objectives are what all objectives should strive to be, and I love them for it. Save Our Seeds are probably the easy objective to design a level around. They can literally just slap it on a normal level, and it will improve the level in most cases. It forces the player to interact with plants, it forces the zombie into a situation where they have to deal with certain plants, and it can add something to any level. Literally, I am of the opinion that adding 2 endangered rotobaggers can make any level feel special, as it encourages the player to use those to their advantage, and can make a level feel better. The thing is that it also allows levels to have a lot more zombies early on. This is great as it helps the game feel more active and frantic. Starting off levels heavily is a great way to get the player to jump right into the good stuff, and this is just brilliant design. But when you build a level around an endangered plant, well, you've hit the jackpot. How does fighting a zombie horde having to time banana shots the entire early game sound? Or an endangered plant level where you have to protect a bunch of spikeweeds from an army of barrel rollers, or forevermore. There is a lot of great uses for them, and this isn't even getting into their ability to create gimmicks out of nothing. Want to make a level where the player struggles to heat their plants? Endangered Torchwood with Escape Route as your only means to heat them. Want to make a level where the player can use a minecart to deal damage to enemies? Endangered Currents with a lock and load objective on top. Even PvP Vanilla gets it on the fun with DA12. Straight up one of the best levels they've ever designed for the game, requiring a player to use Puffshroom's unique traits to their fullest. And I love it. The main issue is that losing endangered plant levels is very likely to feel like it's not your fault at least once. This isn't an avoidable thing, as the player can lose most endangered plants way quicker than you think. This isn't a super solvable issue, beyond just making every plant a wall, and is unfortunate, but I think the level can be replayed enough that this isn't a huge enough issue to really make me dislike it. Overall, incredible. Just incredible. Now, unfortunately, these are the really positive objectives out of the way. We can only go down from here. Whenever an X appears in an objective, it stands for any number. I'm not going to rank each amount of never have more plants individually, as that'd be dumb, just to clarify. Either way, this objective is entirely serviceable, just a bit bland. I like it well enough, but it doesn't really add much alone, as what it encourages is something PZ2 already encourages. Spamming heavy attack as an instance, so it doesn't change much. As a result, it has a habit to not create interesting levels, alone at least. One of the most iconic mod levels of all time, 2.5 and Eclise, does indeed use it, but under strange circumstances and pushing it to the objective's limits. It's like ranking Hurricane's usage as a synergy with Dandelion. It's just not logical, so I don't really do that. Instead, let's consider this objective as it is, and having a trait it already has. Limiting plants does actually cause your approach to some levels to change, and some specific interactions it has can be interesting. Wild West X2 in AltverZ is a good example, though, again, it's a conveyor. Honestly, most of this objective's usage is in conveyors, where the player has to manage plants, but again, not the main thing we're looking for here. In terms of enjoyment, it has a habit of not adding enough to the level. It doesn't do anything, it just sorta exists, and that is unfortunate. In tighter conditions, it absolutely can add something and make levels more interesting. Big Wave Beach 13 is a great example of a level in vanilla that does this, as you are forced into a super active playstyle, which is the peak of PZ2 gameplay. The issue is that people often have an excess of plants they can have. In vanilla, the objective is rare and usually gives you a full 15 plants, which is enough there to be a real tactical issue to be solved, which makes it fairly meh. This objective shines with lower numbers, so I honestly think 10 is pushing it often. As an upside, the player can't lose this objective. It is impossible to create more plants above a maximum, which is fairly darn nice, and like molds, this level rarely will make you lose in a frustrating way. It's a fair limit that doesn't suddenly lose you the game, and that is quite nice. This is the upside of past objectives in general, really, though that doesn't make them good. Listen, Last Stands are some of the best levels when you aren't forced to play them. That's a fair way to view this entire thing. Not just because I say it is, but because that's kinda just how they go. Last Stands are mechanically interesting, but in terms of play just don't work great. Last Stands offers some incredibly interesting level making opportunities. Fend off Gargantua with a Flow Sun, play around a field where the field spams tiles that make zombies invincible, or just general fending off a horde works. Maybe a level which spams Icewind, maybe a level that spams Tide, maybe a level that spawns wizards everywhere, I don't know. There's a lot you can do for this objective, but that doesn't really make anything fun. Here's the issue. Last Stands are some of the most miserable levels to play. They have to be relatively long because otherwise instances can kill every wave at once and just break everything. They can't be too long because otherwise they take 10 years to get back to the, presumably, hard part. As a result, they end up in this weird state where, when it clicks, you sorta just spam instances and win, and that's it. Alternatively, the level can be insanely frustrating. Replaying Last Stand is probably one of the most soul-crushing experiences in PvZ2. They just aren't fun to actually play. Strategizing in them can be fun, that's the only reason I have any points enjoyment at all, but god, they can sometimes be a pain to actually play. Or you literally do nothing, which just isn't fun. And then you lose them. Speaking of which, losing Last Stand suck. Like, really suck. Having to replay so much of a level you already beat just ain't good at all. It's one of the worst ideas you can have, Unfortunately, if you want to make a hard last stand, you need to accept this as an issue, which sorta kills the entire point of being able to make interesting levels. Then again, Pirate Sea's Day 22 is interesting enough, so there is a middle ground here, just one rarely seen. Overall, I really don't like these objectives, but don't worry, we'll be revisiting objectives sooner than you think. Legally, this is an objective, sadly. It literally does nothing. People play like this in normal play quite often. This is literally only used in vanilla to make Garg feel more threatening than they actually are in the early world conveyors. But then they started showing up in normal levels, so it's entirely useless. This objective's entire purpose is dumb, stupid, and what have you. You'll never see a self-respecting LoL maker use this, as they already forgot about it. There is absolutely zero redeeming qualities, as it literally does nothing, except make devs feel more out of control or just encouraging your player to spam power-ups. What a brilliant objective. You'd think this objective was in Ancient Egypt, honestly. It's not, it's mostly in Pirate Seas, of all things. Anyways, this might just be because every mod used it in Ancient Egypt. Mostly because that's the only place this thing can do anything, really. This level objective is entirely passive. Because you get to keep the sun, you just play in a way to produce more sun. That's it. The zombies can't really attack your sun reduction in most cases, though zombies like AltverZ Sun Charmer exist, so you usually just force the plants and zombies into a normal fight. The one exception is conveyors or lock and loaded, where the objective can actually do something, but requiring another objective to be good is not what a good objective should be, and these levels can sometimes be excessively gimmicky if a wrong person makes them. As a result, a lot of mods use it as a filler objective to fill space, and make a player do something slightly different, or as an introduction to sun producing, or advanced sun producing techniques, or the like. This is really the only way to use this objective. In terms of enjoyment, well, it sure does exist, I'll say that much. Again, it barely makes a change in any level it's in, so it's basically non-existent. At most, you'll run 2 sun producers at once, which people already do sometimes. Not the most impactful thing on earth, I'll be entirely frank. Now, thankfully, and unfortunately, you can't lose this objective. Ever. If you know what you're doing, you can beat any level's objective with 1 sun producer. How? By stalling forever. The game literally can't stop you from just spamming walnuts on 1 zombie for up to 10 minutes. I would know, as I did this to beat these levels in a challenge run once. Way to make the objective entirely pointless. Overall, this objective is probably the most nothing objective in the entire game. It doesn't add anything at all, so it just sorta exists. Definitely the most existy objective in the game. No clue why it exists at all. The only reason it's non-D is because it doesn't actively make a level worse, which some other objectives definitely do. Speaking of a devil, this is an objective that has a really bad habit of making levels worse. Flower lines. You know them, you probably hate them, and I'm here to explain them. Yeah. This is one of the objectives that come to mind when you think of objectives. We all know the other one, and I wouldn't say it's for the best of reasons. But it's sort of strong, this objective can create interesting scenarios for sure. Pretty much every zombie can have an interesting interaction with a flower line, as throwing a second lose condition up front can make most things dangerous. The fact some zombies also ignore it add additional strategy. For instance, bug zombies or balloon zombies are able to avoid the flower line while airborne, but not when grounded, creating unique interactions. Zombies like barrels being able to spawn imps forward becomes way more dangerous, and so forth. I also think the actual act of playing these levels is fun. A lot more focus is put onto walls, a plant type that's usually not used all too much, and that's always a good thing to see. Otherwise, these levels use the franticness of PvZ2 in a very interesting and respectable way, and I often find myself enjoying these kind of levels. Unfortunately, often is a word I do not like to use, because that implies the alternative. Insta-loss levels suck. A lot. These are levels where the player can lose instantly for nearly no reason, and I'll be honest, I despise these kinds of levels generally. I think you agree. If a level can force you to lose halfway instantly with little chance of recovery, it tends to be annoying to play. Flower line levels are very susceptible to this, as some zombies can't just drop on top of them, which can really suck. It can feel random, out of control, and especially in more gimmicky takes on this level type, can get rough fairly often. An unfortunate fact of life, but whatever. There is a cheese though. PvZ2 is coded so that if there is a plant on top of the flower line, the zombie will never be able to step on it. You can see this in action if you try to hit a zombie a chili bean on top of the flower line, and they trigger it as soon as they eat chili bean. Now, what would you do if I told you they made an error when coding this? For some reason, this applies to plants zombies can't eat. Like spikeweed. So any flower line where the line is within a tile can be cheesed by putting a spikeweed or spike rock over it. Damn helpful, to put it lightly, and you may want to use this at least once. Maybe. Either way, I'm gonna stay from D tier for now. You can make a strong argument it should be there, but I think the levels are generally fun and stressful, in a fun way, enough that it's not a strict D. But I'm also better than most people at this game, I presume, so that's not a global thing. Whatever. This objective will be a D though. This one is unique in that it has 2 customizable conditions, but these don't really do much for us, sadly. Either way, this objective is pretty damn dumb, so let me cover why. The main issue with the objective is that there's not really a whole lot you can actually do with it. For the most part, there isn't anything unique this objective does when you mix different elements with it. Unless you stack objective with it, I guess. In general, this objective will play the same way. Either the time limit is too long to matter, or the time limit is so strict you have to cherry bomb it all at once, creating the same level each time it appears. Not necessarily ideal, and the main difference is just making this goal harder. In terms of enjoyment, these levels are fine. I put them at B because some people may really enjoy them, but I really disagree. Because often playing super slow is a pretty boring way to play, which these levels encourage strongly. The other reason they are at C is that they do require a good amount of strategy, and holding zombies off long enough to blow up everything is fine. Though longer time requirements are more passive than this, by a lot. The lost condition of these levels can also be fairly annoying, as the player isn't really in the wrong often. A lot of levels can have scenarios where the player needs to get the required zombies by a specific point, before the level becomes entirely impossible, but the player is not unlikely to entirely miss that. Otherwise, levels are so open that they are functionally unlosable. It's inconsistent, and it makes the subjective fairly frustrating if the level is a challenge. Overall, I really don't like subjective. It has a time and a place, sure, but I don't think it deserves use too much. It heavily relies on other objectives to be anything of worth, such as locked and loaded, and so I don't think subjective is worth much in the vast majority of situations. It can make one level 10 times, sure, but it is just one level, sadly. This one might be a bit controversial, but look at it this way. This is just a good last stand. That's how I look at it. That solves the main issue I have with it. With one huge glaring issue you can probably guess. Either way, let's go through it. Spend less than X Sun levels have mostly the same breadth of level topic as a last stand, with a noticeable exception that the level must build up more naturally. This gives less freedom, mostly because you can't really have a level that spams one enemy type too much, at least for the early game, but they do still give a wide array of options, as the player has a hard limit they have to deal with. Now, this is the biggest difference, a last stand level isn't very fun as you usually just end and go. Unlike these, Spend Less on X Sun has an actual game to play that isn't just strategy. You need to build that defense you were setting up at the seed select and ensure that you can actually, well, defend until you get it. It makes a whole lot of difference. Adding gameplay to the game is, shockingly enough, pretty fun. Who'd have thunk? Seriously though, playing with every insta being a more difficult resource to expand is fun, especially when compared to the alternative objective that does this. Now, the biggest issue with objective is that it is very possible to lose this objective accidentally. That is also a huge understatement. You will more often than not lose this objective not because of the level itself, but because you can lose objective by accident. The game doesn't stop you from spending more sun than you are allowed, and this causes an instant loss. An instant loss you will, unfortunately, usually lose to. The life is truly painful. Overall, I would love to put this objective in S or A, but as they never fixed it, it's forced to be in B. It also doesn't help that vanilla weighs this objective hard. It keeps using it in ways to force you to use an absurdly low amount of sun, like 500 or so. In mods which have more room to grow, it is a much better objective, but it's unfortunate that the objective is currently like that. Ah well, maybe for more development it could be fine, but as is, it's just not much of anything. I will note that I think this is still the most underused objective in the entire game, and that includes the mods. I think this objective has some great levels that could be made from it, as long as you look past its issues. Or issue, really. Whatever. It's literally used 6 times in vanilla, was what I was trying to say, and that is hilariously low. Probably the first objective that comes to mind when you talk about objectives. And not for the good reasons, no, but basically the entire reason objectives suck. I feel almost like I have to justify it not being an F tier, because it's so infamous as far as these go. I have my reasons, so yeah. Let's get into those quickly before I dig myself too deep a hole, okay? Okay. Don't Lose More Than X Plants allows level creators to get somewhat unique levels. They heavily discourage the usage of mechanics the player might have gotten used to, mostly instas. This heavy discouragement of instas is genuinely massively influential on how you play through the game, especially the early game. It also adds value to mechanics that the player may not already use, like Walnut Aid, which adds a lot to the levels it's in, and is something I can respect. I also think this makes these levels generally enjoyable to play. You are encouraged to play in a more unique playstyle than you would normally, and that makes things fairly interesting by default. A lot of the most unique and memorable levels I have played have been using this objective, such as Lunatic's 11-4. This doesn't make these levels easy, and I think these can be a fun challenge if you don't mind losing 10 times in a row to random BS you can't control. Yeah, this is a real issue. While I think playing these levels can be fun, I think losing to them is very often absolutely painful. They can feel very arbitrary to lose very often, as with any insta-loss objective. This isn't exactly fun, and I can definitely see why this totally ruins the objective. I personally don't mind as much, I'm just not that kind of person, but I can definitely see this as a very problematic element of the objective for most people. Overall, I kinda feel like I have to put this in D. If I were to make an extremely personal list, this would be in C or B, but I genuinely think I would be murdered if it were any higher, so yeah, it's here now. Maybe people will come around with this objective one day, but I don't think that will happen for a while. I honestly don't think this is a real objective, but whatever. It's a weaker lock and loaded. That's basically it. It's a lock and loaded with only the load and no lock. I won't give it a full section as, let's be real, it doesn't need it. Unlike a normal lock and loaded, it can't force a player into a super unique position, so you probably won't care about it. Ever. It's in C simply because it rarely adds anything to a level, and so I don't think anyone is exactly hyped to see this get ranked. Let's move on. Now this is where the objectives get a little bit more unusual. The rest of these objectives don't exist in vanilla, or rather, they appear in specific mods or Penny's Pursuit. As a result, I will rank these objectives as they are in mods. However, there isn't much for a lot of these objectives. In fact, at least one objective does literally nothing whatsoever. That sure ain't great news, so I'll just rank these in theory if needs be, so yeah. Just stick with me as these are gonna get dumb, very dumb. Okay, let's start with the news one. This is an objective that exists in the files from 1.7's huge change to everything in PC2. I won't go into PC2 lore here because, that sounds painful. Long story short, this objective used to exist, doesn't exist anymore, and the code still exists, so it ends up using mods fairly often. And you can certainly see why it isn't used in the official game there. I'll say that much. In terms of level creativity, this objective is a little barren. It mostly works with zombies that can't be stalled easily, but at best it just sorta exists. You can't make levels around it very well, which is odd as it seems like it should, but in reality levels are often too long for it to be all too meaningful, and, you know, making a level where the player needs to do nothing for 1 to 2 minutes is sorta hard, shockingly enough. But more so than that, well, you can guess. Yeah, this objective kinda sucks to play. I'll be entirely honest, an objective where the main goal is to not play the game for up to 2 minutes or so is about as fun as it sounds. At most, you get a place of Eustolia's Puffs or Iceberg. It's not fun, I'll be entirely honest. It actively detracts from games, and to be entirely honest, really points out how useless active play can really be sometimes. Especially because in PvZ, late game is basically, you beat the level 10 hours ago anyways. Doesn't mesh with PvZ 2 as a whole. As an upside, these objectives don't feel horrible to lose. If you did lose level of this type, the fault is entirely on you, and it doesn't feel awful to lose, usually, as a result. The issue is that you can very easily reset the time if you are still placing icebergs or something and miss. The good news is that these levels are usually easy as the objective is, inherently, fairly simple, so it doesn't matter as much as other objectives. Overall, this objective is a neat idea. On paper. Unfortunately, PvZ2 isn't a pen and paper game, so this clearly doesn't work. I say this objective was scrapped for a good reason, but I could see this objective being very interesting when associated with objectives like flower lines though. Though that might be a little bit evil. These levels are absolutely awful, and I absolutely despise them. These are my least favourite levels I've ever played in PvZ2, and I really do not like them in any real capacity. I can't complain about them as much as I'd really like to, but I can complain about them here, so let's. The only real thing that these levels have going for them is that these levels have a lot of options. Scoring X points has a lot of different variations, with the main two elements usually being tiles that provide extra points or a point multiplier. Both of these offer unique level opportunities, but both of these aren't exactly fun to play. Here's the issue with point objectives. It's hard to quantify. It's often very hard to figure out just how much you have to try, and so they can feel inconsistent at times. It's hard to feel excited about them too. You'd think points would feel exciting, but points mean so little that these objectives can't do a whole lot in that regard. Remember, points have never been a mechanic outside of these levels in the context of the mods that use them. There is no tracked score or anything, it's entirely pointless and arbitrary. And it doesn't help that these points don't mean a whole lot, because most of the points come in the last 5 or so waves anyways. With tiles that give extra points, the level starts to feel slow and frustrating as the player needs to ensure that zombies die on those tiles. With a multiplier, the player has to more or less kill everything all at once to make the most out of it. Not all too compelling. Oh, and the loss condition of these is awful. You see, a lot of point objectives have a bad habit of being entirely unwinnable in some really dumb ways. There are some especially outrageous examples of this. See Eclise Alpha in general, or some one-off levels I've played in Nightcast and Fallen. It's very easy to lose any level of a point score due to really arbitrary reasons. Like the time I lost a level due to killing one less zombie than I should. Twice. Seriously, this is like my least favorite objective PvZ mods have ever done, and I hate it. Thankfully, this isn't the most common thing ever, and mods have definitely moved on in general. Or at least I will personally bully any mod creator in doing so, but this objective has traumatized me enough, so I feel this is worthwhile. Moving on. There are a few more objectives to cover. These are the ones used in Penny's Pursuit, and these have subsequently been used in mods. Mostly. There are some issues here still that I do think are worth enough to cover and discuss, because of course there are. See, a lot of these objectives are comedically bad, so they don't really show up, ever. Some of these are specific, some are super customizable. I won't have great footage for all of these, but if I can, I'll try to give suitable footage when I can. Oh, and the separate ranking will be ditched for an overall one. This will make sense later, as we're just trying to go through these quickly. Let's go. This is one of the weird ones. By items, I mean something called grid items. These are your graves, surfboards, basically anything on the field. I think you can take a guess why this isn't very good, but if you can't, well, the only way these to spawn is basically entirely out of a player's control in most cases. The closest to control the player has is destroying graves slightly quicker to spawn more, or allowing zombies to spawn more grid items, which most will spawn them automatically, with the player only avoiding specific plants that will disable the spawn. It's not that this objective has literally no use, but has very limited use, and thus is a pretty darn bad objective. At least to me. I've basically never had fun with them, so yeah. This one is used a lot. This isn't really relevant too much, though it's probably sad my mood on it a bit overall. The issue of this objective is often that it's a totally nothing objective to complete in more levels than I'd like. Take for instance in Holding Mashup, where a few levels have this objective, but they are entirely tied to the potion mechanic there, which I won't explain properly, but basically dark allocate a bit more, and have a habit to automatically complete themselves. Just simply not a great sign for anything really. The only reason it isn't D is because it does have potential to make some unique levels, but I think it needs more F than other C level objectives, so I can't say this objective is much above destroying X items. It's barely higher though, as there are more ways for the player to control conditions than GI. Kill X zombies of a certain type of spawn. The spawning of zombies is automatic unless the player is finding specific zombies that spawn more zombies. Then the goal is to stall for them to spawn more zombies. Very riveting. I don't care enough to write more about it, so yeah. This objective more or less just wasting time. It auto-completes all their objectives too, so it only works with insta-loss objectives. It's an F mostly out of disappointment. These play as normal levels, but you just need to survive for a certain amount of time, and that's it. If this objective did something cooler, or had compatibility with, I don't know, produce X Sun, I would be fine with it. But it does not, so I do not care. No. Overall, this was a fun list to make. On screen now is the final tier list and tiers, so yeah. I think it's interesting no objectives are in the A tier, but I suppose that does make sense. I do like these objectives overall, but I do think they could have done a lot better with some of them. Maybe if I saw these used better, my opinion would be different. I don't know. However, I should note that this is all my opinion. It is objective in that I am one saying it, so do let me know if you think differently. Spice is variety of life. Though, personally, I think there's one more tier I should rank. The objectives as a whole, which are an S. As much as I do not like some objectives, these things are crucial to making PvZ2 an actually good game. These allow level variety, making a huge improvement from the game before, and I appreciate this a lot. Seriously. Consider this tier list more so an appreciation of what PvZ2 can be. Even low tier objectives can be incredibly interesting if used with strong care. Just because I put Fill of Horizontal frickin' Row in F, doesn't mean that levels can't be made with it. You just have to ensure it can avoid the long and interesting list of flaws I listed. Anyways, let me know what you think of this video. Sorry it took a little longer than I'd like, but I don't really have much of a choice sadly. This video will be long, and I'll be honest, long videos need long amounts of time to work on them. A real shocker. I hope to continue variety up my content, and this should be a great way to test the waters just a bit. Anyways, this was a fun video to make, so I hope you subscribe, as I can't be bothered to declare about it right now, and so, let's end off. This has been Creeps, and have a good one.